Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Okay, now one of my favorite quotes is by Plato, who said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." What does that mean? Only the dead have seen the end of war. Can any of you tell me what that means? Only the dead? Yes.
Okay, I'm going to say yes. I think it's that because war never really ends. There's always people fighting with each other.
Perfect. Perfect. No, you said it all. You really can't do better than that. What it means is that man seems to be in a perpetual state of war. And one of the things that we learned from the American Civil War is that we had two democratic republics warring with one another. 630,000 men were killed in that war by two representative democracies. In fact, the Constitution of the Confederacy would, word for word, almost follow word for word with a few small changes from the United States Constitution. Now, I'm going to share with you American history in a nutshell, and here's what it is. Americans are not extraordinary people, but ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Americans are not extraordinary people, but ordinary people who did extraordinary things. That's true in the Civil War, certainly. The determination, the courage, the sacrifice of that generation was really an amazing thing for those of us who study it. What they did for their convictions was incredible. But it's not only that generation. This is a picture of my uncle, who would be 103 years old if he were still alive. He was a submarine commander in World War II, and he was actually the best submarine commander in World War II. He sunk many Japanese ships, and he killed, frankly, many Japanese, which is tragic, but he also saved many Americans in the process, because those were Japanese usually on their way out, in many cases, on troop ships. In one instance, they were going to Guadalcanal, and the Japanese who got to Guadalcanal all died, virtually all of them, in a great battle there with the Americans, but they killed thousands of Americans. So in the process of sinking a troop transport with a huge explosion that happened, he actually ended up saving a lot of Americans who were not going to be killed by those Japanese soldiers. But the point is, he suffered a great deal in the war. He and his fellow submariners brought the Japanese Empire to its knees by sinking the shipping. You know, Japan's an island nation. And so they sunk the ships and all the shipping and some of the warships of the Japanese Navy. But he would wake up for years afterwards in cold sweats in the middle of the night when he relived the experience of having depth charge dropped on his ship when he was down deep in the water. Depth charges would go off from Japanese destroyers trying to kill them. And several times he came very close to death with his men. Fully 1/3 of those men who he served with in the Navy on submarines never returned. They were killed through being depth charged usually by the Japanese. This is a picture of my uncle with his men. Now, these men transferred out to different submarines during the course of the war, and many of these men never returned. This is a book written by my uncle. I have it here. It's called Slade Cutter, Submarine Warrior, about his exploits. He was just an ordinary man, but he did extraordinary things, as did that generation. Tom Brokaw, a famous newscaster, wrote this book called The Greatest Generation as a tribute to that generation of Americans. The parents of me, the parents of Mr. Tooley, it was our parents' generation that he was referring to as the greatest generation. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So the courage and the sacrifice and the determination of those who fought in the Civil War is not unique to them. Because history is what? It's ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things. I myself have never been in combat, but my first day in the military was May 10th, 1971, and my last day was May 9th, 2011. And during that time, I had some interesting experience. Never in combat, I did see the brutality of war. And these are friends of mine from the 425th Civil Affairs Battalion in Encino. This is Scott Ginsberg, Cole Calloway, and Sean Malis. All three of these men have been deployed to Iraq. They've also all three been deployed to Afghanistan. They have seen things, heard things, and smelled things that no human being should have to experience. But they're just ordinary people doing extraordinary things for our freedom. People ask me why I want to teach. They say the generation today is lazy, self-centered, self-absorbed, and selfish. Why do you want to go into teaching? My response to that is, well, they're just ordinary people. But they will do what? Extraordinary things. That's right. And that's what we do. Americans are ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is a friend of mine, Mike Martinez. Mike and I served together in Fort Carson, Colorado. And Mike had a wonderful wife and a stepson. His wife was an attorney. Really a fine man. And Mike served in Iraq. He was killed January 7th, 2005 with 10 others when his Black Hawk helicopter crashed near Tal Afar, Iraq. What Lincoln said about those men at Gettysburg could be applied to them. They gave the last full measure of devotion. In fact, do you guys remember when I talked about Dodger Stadium and the number of people in Dodger Stadium? How many Dodger Stadiums filled with people died in the Civil War? 13, very good. Well, in all of American history, you could fill Dodger Stadium 27 times. Remember, 50,000 people fit in a Dodger Stadium with those who died fighting for our country, serving our country. People ask me, well, what's the life of a soldier like? And I really like this one quote. It sums up what the life of a soldier is, and it's going to be relevant in some of the upcoming ideas that I'm going to share. Being a soldier is really long periods of boredom, punctuated with short periods of sheer, absolute terror. That's the life of a soldier. What makes the American Civil War so fascinating? It's the relationships. The relationships. Now, what I mean by that is the relationships. There's two kinds. There's the relationships that you're born into with family, and then there's the relationships that you form in life with people who you're not related to. This is the fourth highest ranking general in the Union Army, George Thomas. He was a wonderful man, a great leader, but there's something interesting about him. He was from Virginia. What is odd about that? He was from Virginia. What's odd about that? Virginia was a slave state, and it was the capital, also had the capital of the Confederacy there at Richmond. Absolutely right. Now, how do you think his relatives and friends back in Virginia felt about him in being such a high, important general in the Union Army? Yes?
He was a traitor, or he didn't support what they supported?
Well, they'd look at him as a traitor. Kennedy, that's exactly right. They looked at him as a traitor. In fact, when he died in 1870, which was 5 years after the Civil War, when he died, they told his sister about his death, and her response was, "My brother died in 1861. When he went to fight for the Union, to her, he was dead from evermore. Now, the reconciliations, there were a number of reconciliations, but it was probably more common people had deep emotional scars from the Civil War and antagonisms which they never let go during their lifetimes. You've all heard of Henry Clay. He was a Kentucky senator. He had 5 grandsons. 3 fought for the Confederacy and 2 fought for the Union. They were cousins and they went into different ways. Henry Clay was a senator who was just adored by Abraham Lincoln, and very interesting man. Now, Kentucky was a border state, so that was not uncommon. But what I find really interesting are the relationships that formed when they weren't related, but they were bonds of brotherhood. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, P.G.T. Beauregard, George Meade, George McClellan, and George Pickett were some, but not all men who went on to become generals in the Civil War after serving in Mexico. Let me explain what I mean by this. Here these guys not just served in Mexico. Let me tell you how this went. When they were young men, they went to the West Point, which is the military academy, and they developed great bonds of affection as they faced adversity together. They were roommates often at West Point. They struggled through classes together. And so they had this intimate relationship with each other at West Point, these men. Then after that, they went to Mexico often in the Mexican-American War, which was in 1846 to 1848. And they went to the Mexican War and they were baptized under fire together. They were baptized in the experience of combat together. They saw men die. 2,000 Americans died in the Mexican War, and thousands more Mexicans died in the Mexican War. So they had this bond of brotherhood developed at West Point and then developed in the Mexican War. And then after that, they went into places all over the country where they were stationed together and they formed close bonds. Then in 1861, the Civil War breaks out. And what's really tragic and interesting is that these men who were closer than brothers led great armies against one another in the Civil War. I'm going to give you an example of that. Exactly an example. This man is Lewis Armistead, and this is Hancock. This is Winfield Scott Hancock on your right and Lewis Armistead on your left. Now, these guys went to West Point together. When they got out at West Point, they went in the Mexican War together. Then after that, they were stationed in 1860. They were stationed together in Los Angeles. And they had a big going-away party for them as the clouds of war came over the horizon in 1860. They knew they'd have to go and part ways and go serve their respective home bases, you might say. Winfield Scott Hancock went to the Union. Lewis Armistead went to the Confederacy. And when they saw each other and saw each other for the last time in 1860, they had a great going-away party for them in Los Angeles. I imagine they hugged in a manly hug and embraced one another and were really sad to part ways at that point. Unfortunately, those men were destined to meet again on the field of battle at Gettysburg in 1863. And in that battle, Lewis Armistead was ordered by Lee to attack the center of the Union lines on the 3rd day. And his good friend, Winfield Scott Hancock, was ordered to hold the center at all costs. And it was hoped the Confederates would break through and scatter the Union forces and get a foothold and turn the tide of battle in their favor. I love this print because it really shows the action and it shows a life in this as they attack the Union center. There's William, who's that, by the way? What's his name? Armistead. That's Armistead. That's Lewis Armistead. I'm sorry. That's Lewis Armistead fighting for the Confederacy, attacking the Union center. Great picture. And this is what he was attacking. Now, there were actually many more men than this all over, and he's attacking the Union center. And who's that man? That's right. It's Hancock. It's General Hancock. Winfield Scott Hancock sitting there in the middle, holding the center. You want to know what the outcome of that was? Anybody? Are you guys curious about the outcome? Yeah. Okay. Hancock was wounded badly in his arm, and he had to be carried off the field. They did hold, the Union center did hold. The Confederates were turned back. And Lewis Armistead was wounded in the gut, and he died within 24 hours. He was badly wounded, shot into the gut, and they told him, you know, if that happened to you, you'd only live a day, and then that would be it. And as he lay dying on the field of battle, he was told by a young corpsman that General Hancock had been injured. And so the friendship they had, the love they had for each other just overwhelmed him as he thought about that. And he said, "Tell General Hancock for me that I have done you all an injury which I shall regret the longest day I live." And he was a Christian, Lewis Armistead was, and he had his Bible taken, and he asked for his Bible to be delivered to his friend Winfield Scott Hancock upon his death, which was done. So this man who died had the most precious possession. He had his Bible delivered to the man who led the army that killed him, you know. And I think that's very tragic. It's touching. It's amazing. But it's some of the most interesting stories in the Civil War. I love this picture. Can anybody tell me what this is? What do you think? Yes. Excuse me? Charlie, what is that? Very good, Charlie. It's the barrel of a gun. And what is it? What are these grooves, do you think? Yes.
It's called rifling. It's when they make the
Ryan,
grooves.
it's rifling, right?
Yeah, when they put the grooves in the barrel, so when you put the ball in, as it goes through the barrel, it spins, which produces more accurate shots.
Okay. What happens is, Ryan's absolutely right. The bullet starts spinning. The gases just get that bullet spinning really, really fast. And there are two reasons that it becomes really accurate. The bullet now becomes very balanced. It becomes perfectly balanced. Without the rifling, the bullets have imperfections. Their weight's not very balanced out. Now it's spinning, so it now is perfectly balanced. And then also aerodynamically, it goes through the air much better. Watch what happens here. Rifling like this made rifles deadly at 300 yards instead of 100. Now, 300 yards, it's 3 times the distance for being accurate as it was without the rifling. That's a huge difference, don't you think? How did this impact the battlefield? Do you think it made it better to be defense or better to be offense? Who benefited the most by this change in weapons? Just putting grooves in it, yes? Defense. Absolutely. Excellent, very good. Brandon, very good. The defense, if you were defending, you had 3 times as much space to kill somebody with. You had 3 times the space to defend yourself. Okay, so that would make a big difference. The military care was terrible in the Civil War. This was because of the weapons used, the injuries they caused, and the limited options the surgeons had. Now, when I was in the Judge Advocate General Corps as a lawyer with the Army, I studied the law of war and I taught on the law of war. And the bullets they used then would not pass muster in today's military because of the cruelty of them. And they really didn't intend to make it this way, but it's just the way the technology was. The bullets were made of soft lead. And so a bullet might hit you here in the arm and it would come out your shoulder. And it would spin and tumble. And it would go in, and it was low velocity, and it would just chew up your arm and bone and everything. And then, because of the battlefield disease, the dirt, the filth, the bacteria all over the battlefield, when somebody was shot in the arm or the leg, they'd get gangrene, which would kill them pretty quickly. So the way that they could save their lives was by just cutting off their arm or leg. This is a guy about ready to get his leg cut off on the battlefield. Here's a man who lived through it. He would have a tough time eating after this experience, I would imagine. And this is very sad. A man had both his left and his right arm taken off, but at least he lived. At least he lived. Private Charles L. Sewell, a veteran of the 1st Florida Infantry, was wounded in the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. That was a terrific battle in late 1864. Several days later, his arm was amputated by a Confederate surgeon. He survived the operation and lived into the 20th century. So, really tragic that this kind of thing went on. If you were in the South after the war, you would see a number of men missing arms and legs. How were hot air balloons first used in the Civil War? Does anyone want to tell me how they think a hot air balloon was used? Yes, Kennedy.
Maybe to lift off, lift like.
Okay, that's good, Kennedy. Thank you. Yes, Becca.
Maybe to have a better way at shooting. Like
Better way of shooting.
Scout before like you go into battle.
Excellent, Brandon. That's exactly right. They were used for reconnaissance. It's one of the questions on your worksheet. They were used for reconnaissance. You could look out over the battlefield and see what the enemy was doing. And they would have telegraph wires that would run from the balloon down onto the ground, and they would telegraph what they were seeing up there. What new technologies revolutionized ship warfare? Let's talk about that. There were two basic main ways that technologies revolutionized ship warfare. This is a picture of the way the ships were built prior to these changes. And these are the ships. This is the Virginian, formerly the Monitor, and this is the Merrimack. Excuse me, I forget, the Monitor and the Merrimack. The Merrimack, this was the Merrimack. It became the Virginian by the Confederate Navy. Then this is the Monitor, which was the Union ship. Now, what has technologically changed between these ships and the old ships? Yes. The material used. What's the difference?
Well, I can't really tell, but I'm pretty sure the ships are mostly out of wood.
Yeah, right. Warren. That's right. That's exactly right. Warren. Oh, yeah. Okay, so these are ironclads. These are called ironclads. And they would be hit with the cannon. And see how they sloped here? They'd hit, the cannon would hit, and then it would be deflected off. What happened to these? Were these of much value after the ironclads came out? They were immediately made obsolete. These are pictures of some of the old ironclads, okay? Look at that. They had a lot of punch to them, too. Those cannon could do a lot of damage. This is the second technological change. The Confederates are actually the ones who had this. This is called the Hunley. And the Hunley was the first submarine used. It had a crew of 8. In 1864 in Charleston Harbor, the Hunley attacked the Lusitania. The Eustonia is what it was called. It was a Union ship, and it had a torpedo at the end of this, an explosive charge, which went off and it sank the Lusitania. So it was successful. But they left the hatch open and the water came in, and it sent the Hunley to the bottom of the Charleston Bay. And in the last 10 years, it was fished out. The men, of course, all died in it. Now, that was not the first crew to die in the Hunley. It was actually the third. Do you think the third crew who died in the Hunley knew that that had happened twice before, that it had submarine crews who went to the bottom of the bay and had to be pulled out, and then they just pulled their bodies out? They didn't tell the next crews. No, that was a secret. And so so when those poor guys got in the Hunley, they didn't know the track record of the Hunley. But that was the first submarine, interestingly enough. How did trains change warfare? Well, obviously, you had the cannon sometimes. It could be on train tracks and lob a mortar a mile away. What way do you guys think that trains changed warfare in the Civil War? This was the first war where they really used trains extensively. Julian?
They could transport goods to either side.
Well, that's right. They were really important. Transporting goods was absolutely essential because armies, imagine how much food an army of 100,000 men eats. So, it was important to transfer a lot of supplies to them. And what else did they do, Warren?
They could transport people or ammo.
Transport people. Okay, now I'm going to talk about that. That's it. Transporting people and transporting supplies. Now let's talk about transporting people. That was a huge difference. And in the Battle of First Bull Run, the first major engagement of the war, the Confederates were being beaten back by the Union forces. And just at the moment they were being beaten back, a train load arrived with thousands of fresh troops that jumped off the train, and they joined their comrades in the Confederacy, and they defeated the Union. They just came out and just blew them away, and they called it the Great Skedaddle. And the Union troops just threw their weapons down in panic and ran back to Washington, D.C. I've been out there, by the way, and seen that battlefield twice, and it's about 60 miles, and it was called the Great Skedaddle. And they left. But the point is, the Union would have won that battle if it were not for the railroads coming up and dropping off those troops. Now, what advantages are those troops? What kind of shape were those troops in that the Confederates dropped off?
Good shape, better shape than the ones fighting earlier.
Exactly. They were in better shape, but they wouldn't have been in better shape if they had to go on a forced march and march all night or something and be tired out. So they jumped off that train and they were ready to fight. They were refreshed. So you see, they were fighting against people who'd been fighting all day. So it wasn't much of a match, and it was because of trains that the Confederates, here's another picture of the Confederates, the military railroad. Does anyone recognize what this is? Yes, it's a machine gun. What's it called? Do you know? Gatling gun. Very good. That's excellent, Charlie. A Gatling gun. Charlie got that right. It's a Gatling gun. It's the forerunner of the machine gun. Now, there weren't a whole lot of these, and they didn't make any difference in any big battles, but they were something that was important. What is a flanking maneuver? What does outflanking your enemy do? Ryan?
Attacking them when they don't expect to be attacked.
Close. Julian? Oh, good, yeah. You come in on the sides. I'm going to show you the most significant flanking maneuver in the American Civil War here. This is Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee consulting with one another before Chancellorsville. And this is the Chancellorsville battlefield. The blue is where the Union troops were, and I've been to Chancellorsville. And this is what Stonewall Jackson did in terms of attacking. Now, let me tell you what happened. About noon, the Union troops were here, and they saw what they thought was Stonewall Jackson leaving with his troops and withdrawing far away. They thought that the Confederates were scared, that they were just going to go leave and get a defensive place somewhere. But what Stonewall Jackson did is he moved out here, and then he had them thinking that he was leaving, and then he came around to the side, and late in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock or so, he came into the side. Now, let me tell you what happened. They were all sitting around. Remember I told you that soldiers are bored a lot? They were playing cards. They were singing. They were writing letters home. They were getting dinner ready. They were just sort of chilling out in the forest there. I've been there in Chancellorsville. And all of a sudden, these deer come rushing out through. And then a bunch of birds, thousands and thousands of birds come flying over them right after hundreds of these deer come through. And they're sitting there, what's going on? Then suddenly they're sitting there, and all of a sudden these rabbits and skunks and little critters just start coming, and they're like, wow, this is crazy. Well, because there were 12,000 men coming at them through the forest. And so suddenly, a few minutes later, when they're kind of amazed by this, all hell broke loose as the Confederates just came in the side screaming. And they took a number of Union soldiers prisoner. They killed a bunch of them. And it was only one small part of this very large army. There were about 45,000 Confederates against about 90,000 Union soldiers. But nonetheless, they demoralized them greatly. And so Joseph Hooker, after Chancellorsville, withdrew and went back to Washington in disgrace. That was a great flanking attack. But this was at tremendous cost. Stonewall Jackson was reconnoitering, and he was going out ahead of the lines. And in the late evening, he was coming back, and his men thought that he was a Union cavalryman. And so they fired on Stonewall Jackson, their own general. And he was a great Christian leader, a godly man. He always said that it was his wish to die on the Sabbath. And so he was wounded, and they took him to a house. They brought his wife and his daughter in, and he died 6 days later on the Sabbath, according to what his wish was. And they had the greatest funeral ever given up to that time in the South for Stonewall Jackson. He was a great hero and greatly beloved by the Confederacy and a great general. Famous cavalrymen, let's go over these real quick. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Nathan Bedford Forrest found himself surrounded by a Union army, and he got that way because he went in charging in to a bunch of Union soldiers, and he was going to drive them back, and suddenly he realized his men had left him behind. They'd chickened out, and he kept charging forward. And so he suddenly found himself surrounded by Union troops. And one of the Union soldiers took his gun and looked up at him and fired and shot him up into his rib cage. Nathan Bedford Forrest was one tough hombre, though. He reached down and he grabbed a Union soldier and brought him up into the saddle, and he used him as a shield. Is that consistent? Can you do that under the law of war? Absolutely you can do that. And he took Nathan Bedford Forrest, took that Union soldier and hugged him and held on to him, and all of the Union soldiers said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot, we don't want to shoot our guy." And Nathan Bedford Forrest ran off and got out of that, and then he took that soldier and he just dumped him on the ground and just kept riding. And a week later, a surgeon removed that bullet from the rib of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, if Nathan Bedford Forrest had thrown that soldier on the ground and then shot him in the back as he lay on the ground, would that have been consistent with the law of war? Would that have been a violation of the law of war? Absolutely, you can't do that. But it was perfectly okay to grab that soldier and use him as a shield. And I think it was pretty smart of Nathan Bedford Forrest, one tough guy. This is Jeb Stuart. He was the finest cavalryman in either army. Jeb Stuart was the eyes and ears of the Army of Northern Virginia, of Robert E. Lee's. The women loved Jeb Stuart. He had a big plume in his hat. He was what you'd call a rock star today. He'd go around, they'd go through the towns, and the women would come out and throw things at him and just throw flowers, and he was just a rock star, and he loved every minute of it. He loved being a celebrity for the Confederacy. He was killed near the end of the war at a giant cavalry battle called Yellow Tavern. This is another picture of Jeb Stuart. He was quite a character, very interesting man. This is George Armstrong Custer and Phil Sheridan. Has anybody heard of George Armstrong Custer? Any of you guys heard of George? Yeah, Ryan, you've heard of George Armstrong Custer? Where have you heard of him? He was killed in Montana in 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He was massacred by the Sioux Indians at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This man is Phil Sheridan, who was the third highest general in the Union Army. Phil Sheridan rose to be chief of staff of the Army after the war. He was ordered by Grant to go into the Shenandoah Valley, which was called the breadbasket of the Confederacy, because the Shenandoah Valley, I've been there, has all these farms and this incredible amount of food. It's got great soil, and they just grew all this food and everything that they would send to the Confederate armies. So Phil Sheridan went in with his cavalry, and he was given an order to burn and destroy all the farms. And he said, when I am done with this mission, a crow would have to carry its own provisions to fly over the Shenandoah Valley. So what is he saying when he says that? What does that mean? A crow will have to carry its own provisions to fly over the Shenandoah Valley. What's he saying? Charlie? Yeah. It means he's going to wipe it out, and a crow, he's not going to even leave enough food for a crow to eat, to walk over. And he pretty much did that. He destroyed it, and it made it very hard on the Confederate armies after that. Let me talk about the Battle of Little Round Top. Now, this is a battle that took place at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a battle within a big battle. The man who led that was Joshua Chamberlain, a great Union leader. He went on to become governor of Maine and president of a college, Bowdoin College. And this is a picture of the Union left at Gettysburg and Little Round Top. It's a beautiful place, by the way. Don't you think Gettysburg is? This is a picture right here of what it must have looked like as he got his men in place as the attack came. And it was the Union left, and they were attacked by the Confederates. And if the Confederates could have gotten in there, they'd be able to what? Outflank the Union. If they had gotten a foothold here, because of the position and the elevation and everything, a Little Round Top, it might have destroyed the Union. And the whole Civil War, it's speculated, maybe could have had a different outcome if Little Round Top had not been successfully held by Joshua Chamberlain. They came down and swung around. When you guys go to Gettysburg, I know a lot of you are going to Gettysburg. How many of you are going to Gettysburg? Okay, yeah, most of you are going to Gettysburg. You'll learn about this. This is so fascinating, this kind of stuff, and how he did this and led his men bravely down in a counterattack against the Confederates. What impact did the Civil War have on the spiritual life of the nation? Have any of you heard of the Bible Belt? The Bible Belt is an area in the South. They call it the Bible Belt because there's a lot of churches per capita, a lot of Christian churches, a lot of Protestant churches. And I want to talk about that. Now, I don't really understand how this is possible, but I have to share this with you. Robert E. Lee was a godly Christian man. And so was Stonewall Jackson, and yet they fought for a side that I think had some real problems in terms of some biblical principles regarding the fact that men are created in God's image and some other concepts regarding respect for each other. But these were great men in their own right. They were great soldiers and they were great gentlemen. And Thomas J. Jackson, there's this book written called Christ in the Camp, the true story of the great revival during the war between the states. And both Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee made sure that the Confederacy was stocked with evangelical chaplains. And remember I told you at the beginning that the life of a soldier is one of boredom punctuated by short periods of terror. Well, there were long periods where they just didn't have a whole lot to do. And there were these great revivals that swept through the Confederate camps, much more so than in the North. And they got Roman Catholic priests, as a matter of fact. They got some Roman Catholic priests for the men, but they had a lot of really great preaching in the Confederate camps. There's another book called The Great Revival in the Confederate Armies by W.W. Bennett. This was written by a contemporary who actually went through and lived with the Confederates in the camps. And there's a picture of Stonewall Jackson there. I like that picture of Stonewall Jackson. And so the impact that these revivals had on these men, many of these men, of course, lived through the war and then they returned home. And they helped to build churches, and they helped to plant churches, and they witnessed, and they really, it was a time where God's grace was really poured out in a part of this country that had long-term impacts, and that was in the revivals in the Confederacy, which really changed the cultural flavor of this country in many ways. So that is something that can't be underestimated. Finally, I said that the life of a soldier is really a challenge. It's really a lot of boredom. And so what do you think soldiers did when they were bored? They played sports, yeah. Baseball was considered a great equalizer. There were enlisted and there were officers. Now, I've been both, by the way. I've been enlisted for a while and I was an officer. And men would play baseball and there was a great camaraderie that developed between the men who were officers and enlisted. And so baseball really developed from the Civil War. The rules of the game solidified. For example, in the Army camps, they would play baseball and they'd use what were called the Massachusetts rules. There were some, do you guys like baseball? Are there baseball fans here? Okay, a lot of you really like baseball. Okay, prior to the Civil War, there were some places where they would play baseball, and if you just took the baseball and you threw it and hit a guy while he was running, he was out. That was crazy, I know. It's very, well, no, they didn't like it, because if soldiers do that, soldiers are very competitive, and if you let soldiers do that, they're going to hurt each other badly, and they don't want, the enemy may hurt you, but they don't want the men hurting each other. So they made the rule that you'd have to catch the ball and tag the guy, and so they made it a little safer that way. But baseball, they were crazy about baseball. And so it got going there, and that's because of the Civil War.